Welcome to Behind the Melodies. I am Rebecca Willie, Executive Director of Music for a Great Space, and today we are going to be talking with Alceé Chriss, who is an organist. He's going to tell you a little bit about where he's from and music that he's going to perform on our series, and we're delighted to talk with him. So let's get started.
Okay, so why don't we start out by talking a little bit about how you got started on the organ?
Sure. I was one of those kids who happens to be a preacher's kid. And so church was like really just a giant part of my childhood. And because music was such a vibrant part of the church, I kind of really had no choice but to be exposed to music really early on. My mom always sung in the choir, so there was always kind of like an undercurrent of music in the family. My mom was a great singer, and my dad also played percussion in high school. So music was always around. I had plenty of aunts and uncles who had basic level keyboard skill. Interesting thing on my mom's side of the family is that her father did not allow the boys to play certain musical instruments because back in the day they actually thought that it meant you were soft, if you catch my drift. So my mother's brothers were only allowed to play like drums, guitar, masculine instruments. But then on the other side, um, all of the women played piano. So I had three aunts who always kind of like were teaching me little things going along. And it kind of just progressed naturally from there. Yeah, I mean it's if you really love music and you're in the church and you have no choice but to sort of be exposed to it every day, as they say, you feel like you want to ascend to that level. I was looking up to the choir directors in these churches and the pianists, like what they were doing to me at the time was a whole nother world. And I think it was that attraction to that really kind of got me into music. It's like, oh, I want to do what they can be able to do. So that's a long answer for you. But I played piano forever, probably until I was 15 or 16. Probably started piano around 6 years old. Um, and I would say organ came late, mostly as an obsession more than a craft. Mostly just really interested in the organ, but not really having the means or really the incentive to go and seek it out. But I think once I turned 16, one of my piano teachers let me play a pipe organ for the first time, and that was really pretty eye-opening. But I'll be honest with you, listening to organ recordings was way more cool to me than playing some of the terrible organs that were around me at the time. But hearing like recordings from Germany, I remember Carl Richter, Virgil Fox, as a kid, just being such a nerd, like, just listening to organ recordings, as a 15 or 16-year-old, it's just super nerdy, but it was really a driving force. The other thing is my mom really pushed me towards the organ before she passed in 2009. That's like one of the last things she did was to actually enroll me into the Oberlin Summer Academy in 2009. So I'd have been like 16 or 17. So that was the first time I'd gone to a college campus and seen college students and professors. And so it was like, I think a week or two there where I spent, and then I ended up getting my bachelor's and master's there at Oberlin. And it's interesting because there were people at my Dallas high school who were going to Oberlin. So that school had always been on my radar.
Do you remember the first time that you got to play around with maybe a manual organ and kind of pulling all the stops and playing around with that? Was there a one memory that kind of sticks out to you for that?
Well, the first organ I played was not that great, but I do know there's actually an instrument down the street from my house, First Presbyterian Church of Fort Worth, Texas. I'm a Fort Worth guy. That's where I was born and raised. Yeah, that was a big five manual giant keyboard instrument. Yeah, where it was just the thing is I would go on the internet. This is hilarious. I would go on the internet and just look at these pictures of these organs all day and just be like, oh my gosh, like if only I could play them. And so it's so funny you spend so much time dreaming. I mean, there's in this documentary I'm in, there's a scene I tell about how I used to pull out my little $50 electronic keyboard, and then when the pipe organ would come on the screen on the TV, I would play along, and that's the best I could do. I mean, we're talking true like obsession very early on. But the funny thing about it is I think the spaces themselves, which is kind of complicated, but I think the spaces themselves were as attractive as the organs. I mean, I was playing in eventually big giant churches in Dallas, and I think there was something I really enjoyed about the sort of the sort of churches that had pipe organs and the type of worship that like came along with that is the best way I can put it. Because that's not what I grew up with. I grew up gospel, and I love that stuff. That's my first love, but it was interesting going from like total amateur music making, right? Like I'm not trying to be mean, but for me to go to total amateur music making to like ultra professional pipe organ music making, it was just like a very developmental thing for me, for sure.
I can imagine. So that kind of so we talked a little bit about the fact that you're from Texas, and so now you live in New York City or in the area on the East Coast.
I live in Connecticut and New York.
Okay,
So I work at Trinity Wall Street, and I'm also assistant professor at Wesleyan University.
that's awesome. And I'm sure that you've gotten to travel in lots of wonderful places to perform. Do you have like a favorite organ that you played on, or a favorite space that you've been in, or maybe just a favorite performance memory that really spoke to you for some reason?
Now, do you want one that's sentimental or do you want one that's hilarious? You have to decide.
Ooh, I kind of want both.
Okay, I'll tell you one sentimental one and one hilarious one. I mean, going to Europe is a very special thing, I think, in a way, because it's not a place where African Americans or people of African descent really have like a strong presence in the organ scene. And it's not to say that there's not plenty of Black organists, especially in the States, the UK, but I think especially going to these spaces and really feeling how open people are and how interested people are. I really think that those are the things that have really gotten me, like playing in France and various, places, and playing in Sweden. Oh, one great, I'll tell you the gig. It was probably in Sweden at the Stockholm City Hall, which would have been the opening of the International Stockholm, Organ Festival. And so this is where they give out the Nobel Prize. So this is a huge, like, luxurious ballroom. And so I got access to this super protected museum of a space like 5 days. They don't let anyone in there. It's locked down. So just to be in there in such a historic space, really, really cool. And then probably the hilarious story is going to China to play an incomplete organ that was actually shipped from this part of the country in Boston. And that, yeah, basically they hired me to come down there. China was awesome, by the way, really cool. They kind of have a real obsession with the organ in some parts. And when I went there, they actually have an organ museum where they've just taken organs from all over the world and put them into a museum and maintain them. But in this case, they had bought a 100 rank organ from Boston, shipped it to China. And so then when I get there, there's all these government dignitaries who they're like trying to like make sure, like, oh, we want to make sure the organ sounds good. But here's the thing, the organ isn't finished. So you've got me up there playing with 3 organ builders on either side, just like trying to just make it seem as if this organ is complete by like turning off stops when it was just a very interesting experience. Also a wonderful experience, being in China. Very, very special. I think when you travel the world for music, you're always surprised at people's generosity, is what I would say. Because I mean, for me, traveling can be scary, just not knowing, where you're headed to and what it's like. But I have to say, I've almost never had a negative experience, even playing in places like in Eastern Europe and Latvia and what have you. Just often, just awesome people on the road.
That's wonderful. It's nice to hear positivity about travel, because I feel like so much travel stories these days are negative. I love the idea of all these organ builders around you, like just
Yeah,
trying to patch things together.
in real time. Yeah,
That's
that was
crazy.
special.
Okay, so maybe you can tell us about one of the pieces on the program and why you chose it.
Right. I think the coolest piece would probably be Somewhere Over the Rainbow by Harold Arlen. The arrangement was originally thought of by Oscar Peterson, but I had to kind of like make it an organ piece. So I took what Oscar had and really kind of exploded it into like organ dimensions. And so I think the cool thing about it is this piece kind of tests the organ's like natural abilities towards like early music, and really is going to pull a sound out of the instrument that I don't think people will have heard before, in terms of sort of getting that more sparkly, jazzy sound. And I think going along with that, there are a lot of pieces on the program that really are going to test the organ's ability to be like more present and contemporary, and like speak in a voice that can like accommodate this music. So that's why I really get excited about that piece, because it will not be your run of the mill sort of like churchy organ sound. It's going to be something really, really unique.
Um, so that's really interesting to me. I'm not an organist, so this is not my background. But so, what does that mean to you? Like a kind of a more modern sound? Like,
Oh, you're going to get me in trouble with the organ gods upstairs. But I'll be honest with you. The funny thing about Fisks that I've learned, because I played one at Oberlin for 5 years as like my primary instrument, these instruments have great flexibility. They have unlimited flexibility. The problem is that when kids like me go to school, we're given like a list of do's and don'ts about what you're supposed to do, and which stops can go together, which stops you don't use together, right? And while that's great to an extent to avoid, catastrophes, I think that also cuts you off from like 80% of the possible sounds that the organ can do. Because as soon as you start putting X's on, oh, you can do this or that, it really becomes a thing of like, well, we only want the organ to sound this way. So I think what we would do for church, for instance, would be to support the congregation. And of course, in those sorts of settings, you want to be strategic. Yes, pull these stops to support them. But when it comes to like imagination on the organ, I think especially with that Somewhere Over the Rainbow piece, you have to be willing to break the rules to get a sound that you may not be like used to with that instrument. The funny thing is about me is that I went to some of the most relatively conservative schools, went to Oberlin for my bachelor's. I got a master's in early music, which is extremely archaic, basically historical musicology. And then I got a doctorate in organ. It's funny that I didn't really become so, I wouldn't say radicalized, but I would say more open in a way to other things until going to Wesleyan. And I had students that were so interested in the organ, but from such different angles. So instead of a kid saying, oh, I want to go learn the hardest Bach piece, they were saying, hey, Alcée, I want to write the coolest organ piece ever thought of in the style of XYZ composer. And all of a sudden, it was like everything I had learned in school about rules, this or that, were no longer like applicable, because I have kids who are modern, they're 20 years old. They don't know anything about the rules, but they love the organ. And I think that has really reoriented me as a performer, just to be like, my whole point is to just get people to love the instrument and not to check any boxes. So,
right. I love that. I love the idea that your students are inspiring you too. That's lovely to hear.
I had to learn somehow.
Do you have like favorite music that is not, well, I'll say, how about not classical organ music?
Oh, absolutely. I listen to a lot of salsa and jazz and funk music. The funny thing about me is that I can listen to just about anything. Like there used to be a point where I would turn things off on the radio because I'd be like, "Oh, I can't stand to listen to this." But the funny thing is, coming to Wesleyan, going back to that, I can truly enjoy just about anything. But for me, my personal loves are definitely jazz, gospel music, and funk. And to be honest with you, if we're talking about what is my life outside of music, is mostly my dogs. Here, come here, Dodos. Y'all want to have a little camera time? All right, here.
Yay!
All right, here we go. All right. Hi,
Hello.
Pumbaa. Hello, Kiki. Wow, I wish I could take this blur off.
What are their names?
Pumbaa, Simone, and Kiki.
Oh, nice. That's awesome. So dogs and jazz, gospel, and funk was what you said. Is there anybody in there that like maybe we wouldn't know about that we should be checking out, that you're like, oh, this artist is amazing and you should totally be listening to them?
That's funny you say that. Yeah, there are a couple bands like Snarky Puppy, Knee Body, a lot of these groups. Who else could I name? I mean, even for me, I know this is such a really basic one, but if we're talking about people high on my list would be Chick Corea as well. Because Chick Corea is another guy who in his later years started recording a lot of classical music into his albums and
Mhm.
doing improvisations in the style of Mozart, in the style of Ravel, and in some cases just simply recording, Chopin pieces and things like that intermixed with jazz. So I think yeah, I think that's definitely where my mind has been about the slept on repertoire, is that kind of genre bending repertoire. Yeah.
Thank you so much for talking with us today, Alcée. It's been a delight to get to know you. We are so looking forward to your program October 25th, 7:30 p.m. at Christ United Methodist Church. Um, Alcée will be playing works of Bach and Buxtehude and Schumann, Florence Price, Rachel Lauren, lots of wonderful music for organ, as well as he mentioned his arrangement of Somewhere Over the Rainbow. So we hope to see you all there and looking forward to it.